Hello, my History 157 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 5. We are more than halfway through the course. Yay, right? Halfway through the course. And with that, that means we're in the second half. You have basically 2 more major assessments, one that was actually due by the end of the day last night, and the other one that's due at the end of the semester, which is your final exam, worth about 30% of your grade. So 2 assessments combined are 40% of your grade. So it is still important, with 4 more weeks left, to be active in discussion. So I'm going to talk very briefly about that and the substance of the discussion as well, and talk about week 5. But anyway, um, so that's really all that it is. Once we get past me grading your week 4 primary source assignments, that's it until the final. So you have plenty of time. You have a month basically from today, roughly a month, 30 days or so, to get your final exam done. It's open book. It is not time. Please work on it, right? This is your first warning. I'll probably be warning you every week, and sometimes probably twice a week during the last 2 weeks of the semester, because I don't want people to bitch and moan about how difficult the exam is, and not everything's in the textbook or any other things. You know why? You have 4 weeks. There's nothing stopping you from getting a perfect grade on this other than you not taking the time to do the exam. It's multiple choice of a short answer question, which is roughly a healthy paragraph, probably about 200 words. And then then you've got two fill in the blanks. It shouldn't be that hard. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure you do that. So let's start with week 5. And I don't want to week 4 discussion. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I know that some of you, probably because of other duties, military duties, etc., didn't have time to complete everything for week 4. So please if you have an outstanding post for week 4 or outstanding, and by outstanding, I mean you haven't submitted it yet. Not that it's great, right? Words have more than one meaning. So, or something that's outstanding in terms of you haven't posted your responses to other students yet, please do that. You have a week past deadline to do that as standard in the syllabuses for UMGC's history program. So please get that done so you can get your full credit for that and move on.org. Um, that was a joke. So please get that done. And, about a third of the class either didn't do their initial post or any post, or they did an initial post and didn't do responses to other students. So please get that done as soon as you can, before you lose the chance to get credit for it. As far as the substance of the week 5 discussions, let me just say this. Listen, there's nothing unpatriotic about finding fault in U.S. policies, right? There's nothing unpatriotic about being critical. Matter of fact, not only is it our right, it should be our responsibility to say, hey, not everything we did was kosher. A lot of things we've done on the world stage have been kind of ugly. You don't have to defend the U.S. You don't have to see the U.S. Just because the U.S. happens to have this great history of being a great, you know, having a great economy and, being out in the world, winning wars and all that, that speaks to America being a powerful country. But a powerful country doesn't always do great things in terms of great things that make people feel good about themselves, to make the world a better place kind of thing. The part of the reason the world is the way it is because the way the U.S. has been as a world actor for the past 120 or so, 125 years. So I don't understand this, I'm going to tiptoe around things that we did kind of thing. Especially if you are in the military, you have probably, in some respects, you have more reason to have a more marbled view of the U.S. than us, non-gun carrying in the times of war civilians, right? So reading some of the responses where people were making the U.S. a superpower a full 50 years before the U.S. was actually a superpower, or saying that, U.S.'s brand of colonialism is not real. It's not the real colonialism practiced by the British. When in fact we completely copied the British model. We copied the British model, and particularly the Philippines, with Puerto Rico, with all these other places, but with Hawaii. I mean, we literally copied the British model of basically sending people in with economic interest into different countries, and them, you know, messing with the politics of that particular country, and then when that country erupts in some sort of civil war or chaos, sending our troops in and saying, "Oh, we're going to stabilize things for the betterment of your country," when in reality you're stabilizing things for your military and stabilizing things for the companies that are operating there. That's what the U.S. did in Hawaii. That's what the U.S. has done in places like Cuba over the years, along with Puerto Rico, along with Guatemala. I mean, we go on and on and on. But the bottom line is that a lot of this started during the Spanish American War and became intensified during and after World War One, as I said last week. So, to point that out is these are facts. You can draw whatever conclusions you want from those facts, but these are the facts of the situation. So the U.S. was a regional power prior to the basically late 1890s, became a world power roughly in the 1890s, became a world power on the same plane as the British and the French and Germans by the end of World War One, right? But it wasn't a superpower. The U.S. could have become a superpower probably by the 1920s, but we went into isolationism after World War One. Literally a year later, when we decided not to ratify the Treaty of Paris, Treaty of Versailles, in 1919, we decided not to ratify, and as a result, we were done. We were done. You can't become a superpower and then decide, oh, we're not going to be involved in the world. That's the very definition of superpower. World power that's so powerful that its reach all over the world has to keep them active in the world. Okay, I don't, Anyway, so there is that. So anyway, this is not a civic patriotism class. This is a history class, right? You're not required to be a super patriot or a hyper patriot or a military patriot to be able to look at this stuff and understand it. So anyway, so I just wanted to spend some time on that. Anyway, so we're now in week 5, and week 5 takes us into the so-called Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression period and everything that comes with it, the 1920s and 1930s. Except that we're skipping over quite a few things in doing that. If you watch the History Channel and the so-called American Heroes Channel, you can learn about the 1920s fairly quickly. In a nutshell, it's prohibition and speakeasies where people are sneaking in drinks that they're not supposed to have, alcohol, right? And organized crime, the Dutch Schultzes and Al Capones and Nitties and um, what's his name from New York, and the five families in the 1920s and 30s, and so on and so forth, right? And the truth of the matter is that that's the sensationalism in the 1920s, and some of that's going to be in your textbook because it's very basic. Your textbook does not have a lot of nuance to it, right? I try to ask you questions that pertain mostly to what's in the textbook because of that, because I don't want folks necessarily looking up all kinds of stuff. But it does help sometimes to do outside reading, to use an outside reading or two, as it showed in week 4. But for week 5, I think the main thing I want to concentrate on is the hypervisibility of the sensational, and really in any historical period, in any thing, but in U.S. history in particular, versus the things that we underplay, right? And so here are the things that get sensationalized, right? Prohibition passes along with the 19th Amendment, and 18th and 19th Amendment get passed in 1920 or so. 1921 to 1933, there's a 12-year period where It's not legal to go out and get a drink. Funny thing is, in point of fact, if you look in detail at the 18th Amendment, you can get a drink. You can actually get it. You can drink. It is not illegal to drink alcohol. It's illegal to buy it. It's illegal to distribute it. It's illegal to make it. But it's not illegal to actually have a drink, right? It's not actually. Can you explain this to me, right? So, but you do the speakeasy thing not for the customer's sake, but for your sake as a bar owner, your sake as a club owner, to make sure that when you're raided by what would become the FBI, what would become ATF, you actually have the ability to go, oh, you can't find alcohol here, right? So, and that is part of the culture. Flappers and these working class and, quite frankly, middle class white women, and to some extent black women too, hanging out at these places, all hours of weekends, and so on and so forth. That's all part of the 1920s. But just like all these so-called leftists, and I say so-called because most of them aren't leftists, they're center-right people who claim that that they were part of some movement. The women, these baby boomers claiming they were part of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, or gay movement before it became the gay and lesbian movement, or even the civil rights movement. Love talking about how everyone was radicalized in the 50s and 60s, which is also a bunch of BS. Most people were not radicalized, and most people, while they might have had sympathy for these causes, weren't going out and marching for them. Same thing is true in the 1920s with regard to these other activities. There might have been lots of people involved in these activities, but the vast majority of Americans in the 1920s and 30s were not going to speakeasies. Most white women were not wearing dresses and cutting their hair into pixie cuts and and things of that nature, right? That's just not the case, right? And just because you were doing that doesn't mean that you were some, socialist leftist either, right? Whatever that means. So I just wanted to highlight this to say that that's not what this period really is. This period is much more chaotic than even organized crime would lend itself to. It's a chaotic period because the U.S. finds itself caught between the U.S. it becomes for most of the 20th century and the U.S. that it's been for the previous 50, 60 years since the end of the Civil War. A government that primarily concerns itself with the interest of business and keeping businesses happy, while economy that sort of boom and bust cycles every 7 to 10 years, union busting, right? Demographic shifts that can be fairly wild, and swings that lead to growing pains within the country. A country that is built on imperialism, believes in colonialism, but at the same time tries to present itself as a force for good in terms of democracy, but at the same time doesn't want to be that force for democracy because there are forces within it that don't want to be involved in war outside of the U.S. anymore, right? Leading to isolationist policies, right? And a country fundamentally that, while there are certainly aspects of it that are shifting toward what we now have as a consumer-based economy that we've had pretty much since the start of World War II, but in reality, there's not enough of a middle class. There's not enough of a fundamental base of wealth outside of the very wealthiest people in the country to really have a consumer-based economy. So the country's going through a lot of growing pains in this period, right? And one of the reasons why you end up with a country that ends up going into the Great Depression in the 1930s, it's a complicated issue. It involves credit provided, billions of dollars of credit to Germany so that Germany can pay off its 6.6 billion marks worth, Deutschmarks worth of reparations to the UK and to France for it causing World War One, even though they didn't actually cause World War One. They're all culpable. British are culpable, the French are culpable. Quite frankly, the U.S. is culpable because they're supplying arms to all sides and so on and so forth. But Germany got the blame, right? And that $6.6 billion is more like $650 billion by the time modern Germany paid it off about 11, 12 years ago. That's a lot of money to pay the two countries. And their economy was crippled as a result of that. There are Germans who are starving because of that, right? It actually helped it was part of the reason why you had the recession of 1919 to 1921. Once the war was over, demand for US products dropped like a rock. And we kept overproducing in terms of agricultural products and other kinds of products, even though the demand dropped. And this is also a period, by the way, there's no free trade, right? There is, generally speaking, no free trade between different parts of the country. There's no European Union. There's no um, agreement among countries for free trade, no free trade zones, right? The most free trade in the world is basically between Canada and the US. There's no such thing as free trade. So you take advantage of that by having high tariffs for imported products, which means only the rich can afford those things. So, so the country rolls right from World War I into a recession in 1919 to 1921. And here's an aspect of this, that doesn't get talked about within the context of what's happening in this period, aside from lots of African Americans moving north for jobs during World War I and immediately aftermath of World War I as part of a great migration, which 1.5 million of them moved to cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Boston, etc., right? In addition to race riots, is the fact that there's a recession going on. And part of it's blamed on World War I. But here's the other part that we don't talk enough about, especially in the context of what's going on, and it's been going on in this country for the last 2.5 years, which is there's also the Spanish flu pandemic going on at the same time, which between 50 million and 100 million people, it's probably closer to 100 million mark, according to most epidemiologists and most historians, died from the Spanish flu between 1917 and 1922, right? And someone like 675,000 Americans died. But you can bet everything. I would bet my next year's salary to tell you that that number is much higher than 675,000. It's probably closer to 1.3 million people, with millions more getting sick from the flu. A whole generation of folks exposed to a new kind of flu that we're still kind of dealing with to this day. All those flu shots that are available year after year after year are in response to this. And what happened with the Spanish flu more significantly is that the federal government did nothing to protect people, right? Just like they did nothing to protect workers when they get sick or get injured on the job, just like they did with union busting and allowing unions to be part of yellow contracts, yellow unions, where um, where management got to basically give you whatever contract you wanted, create their own version of a union where you were completely tied to whatever they said, and that was that. That's not a union. That's that's just bad, right? So just like with that, same thing with the Spanish flu. Um, States, individual school districts, even in D.C., temporarily tried to shut things down for maybe a month or couple of months, but because that slowed the economy down, they immediately opened up stuff. And just like now, people stopped, only handfuls of people even would buy masks and wear them. Most people were like, what's this? I'm not wearing that. And so, of course, lots and lots of people got sick. And the implications for epidemiologically for this population continued long after the quote so-called this pandemic came to an end in 1921-22. For another generation, really, people were getting sick from, variants of this flu that were unprecedented on a scale. And when you combine that with tuberculosis, when you combine that with emphysema from doing certain kinds of work, particularly in mines, coal mines, those kinds of things, you had a very unhealthy population in the 1920s and 30s too. That has to be a factor, but we don't talk about that. And just like people don't want to talk about the pandemic now and think the pandemic's over now, people stopped talking about it after about, after the first half of 1920, right? Even though there's evidence that even Woodrow Wilson himself came down with the Spanish flu during his negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The Smithsonian Channel is good for a few things, and plus I read this somewhere too. It's in books, but the Smithsonian Channel is good in that regard. And so this is completely undercovered. How are you going to have a healthy economy when you got millions of people sick um, from from a pandemic, right? How are you going to have a healthy economy when there's basically, for the most part, people are left to their own devices and left to their own fates in the midst of this, like this is some kind of grand eugenics experiment to see who can survive a pandemic and who can't, right? You can't have that. And so this idea that the American economy was roaring in the 1920s, when you combine it with all these other things that are going on, sounds almost nonsensical, to be perfectly honest. So, but anyway, I wanted to bring up the nearly erased period of U.S. history that includes a pandemic going on in the midst of all of this versus the sensationalization of, oh, everything's great and everything's wonderful. Everything's great and everything's wonderful when you're making just enough money to pay off all the debt that you're accumulating in order to buy a handful of goods. The consumer-based economy that tries to come online in the 1920s is basically premature, right? So if you think about the Roaring Twenties, it's really roaring if you are in major cities. So if you are you're the 15% of the country that's part of the middle class, right? For those people, it probably is the Roaring Twenties. A good portion of the flappers come out of this group, right? You can have the Great Gatsby period of excess in the 1920s if you have money, but you can't have a full scale consumer based economy when it's only 15, maybe 20% of the population. The rest of the population has to do everything on credit in order to afford stuff. And I mean everything. You can run a tab at a grocery store back in these days. I mean, think about that. Can you just go to a store and go, "Hey, I'm taking $30 worth of food. Can you put it on my tab?" The only place in the world, in the U.S. world anyway, where you can put anything on a tab is basically a bar, right? Go to a bar, you can run a tab, and these are local bars. I mean, if you just come from out of town, I seriously doubt you can just start a tab while during your 3-day business trip and then leave, right? So food's on the tab. You're borrowing to buy a bed. You're borrowing to um, buy a car, a refrigerator. You're borrowing to buy a washing machine. I mean, that's how bad things were. The average American worker is making maybe $1,500 a year, right? That translates to roughly about $130,000 in today's money. That sounds great, but it's not true for any number of reasons. Not the not because $1,500 is still $1,500 in these days. It's not. It might seem like it's the equivalent of that due to inflation, but those people are paying for everything on credit, and the result of that is that and plus these families are depending on that one person. Plus if you're an immigrant family, you're not at that average, and so everyone's working. Kids are working, et cetera, et cetera. So this situation is bad. Just as the rural economy, keep in mind 51% of the American population by 1920 is living in cities. But that still means that nearly half the population is living in rural areas. They're living on farms. They're living in rural communities. They're much smaller. And so even though the recession ends in 1921, they're still continuing to reel from the fast drop in agricultural product prices um, during the 1920s. They go up somewhat in the period between 1922 and 1926, but not a lot. They never fully recover from the World War I highs, basically until the 1940s. I'm serious about this, and so the result is that when there's between the boll weevil attacks on cotton in the 1910s and 1920s, between loss of agricultural workers, in the 1910s and 20s who are moving, not just black ones from migration, but white ones as well. Two-thirds of all sharecroppers in the States are white. So, them moving too doesn't help. And so the rural economies of the United States fall into a depression in 1926, 3.5 years before the stock market crash of 1929. 3.5 years before, right? It just takes that long for an overheated, heavily credited consumer-based economy to run out, right? And then you combine that with all these countries all shutting their borders to imported goods, so that there's no sharing of the wealth of their different economies around the world to prevent a depression. So one economy after another, once their stock markets crash, once people get let go in large numbers, one after another, that's the cause of the Great Depression, because there's no free trade. There's too much credit, not enough actual value. And quite frankly, there's an overproduction of goods for not enough people to buy them in the period of time that we're talking about. So we'll stop there.